Good afternoon. Welcome to our series 2020 Philosophers, dedicated to new generations of thinkers committed to the 21st century. It's a great pleasure to introduce Corine Pelluchon, who embodies this revival of French-speaking philosophy. Corine is professor of philosophy at Gustave Eiffel University in the suburb of Paris, and she works on ethics and politics. She was inspired by Leo Strauss and Emmanuel Levinas. She is famous for her reflection on animal rights. And let me say that it's a real commitment in a country as carnivorous as France. And she wrote an amazing manifesto on the politics of animals. More broadly, she emphasizes the notions of vulnerability, corporality, and emotion. She always keeps in mind the necessity of rethinking social contract by taking care of all the livings, human and non-human. So, her thought is in the heart of our contemporary concerns about the planet and the search for a new humanism. Corine wrote many books, including the most recent Nourishments, Philosophy of the Bodily Politic, published by Bloomsbury in 2019, Réparons, le monde, Humains, animaux, notre, to fix the world, human beings, animals, nature, by Rivages in 2020. And her next book is forthcoming in 2021, Les Lumières à l'âge du vivant, Enlightenments at the Edge of the Living, published by Le Seuil. Today, she will give a lecture entitled Taking Vulnerability and Corporality Seriously. What does it change for ethics and politics, and why it could make ecology and the animal cause enter democracy. Let me remind you our protocol. Corine will speak half an hour, then we'll discuss on the situation of philosophy today, and you can ask her questions using the Q&A on your screen. Corine, welcome to La Maison Française.
So, the main theme of my research is corporality. What does it change for ethics and politics when we take corporality seriously? What light does it shed upon our human condition? To be sure, we as human beings are characterized by freedom, understood as the ability to make personal choices and to change them. The conception of human being as a free moral agent is at the core of human rights philosophy and still grants our political and ethical theories. It enables us to grant every human being some rights, whatever could be his gender, race, or social status. In this regard, modernity achieves a moral progress compared to the ancient social order, which was based on inequalities and privileges. Yet this individualistic and even atomistic conception of the self and this focus on freedom underestimate our dependence upon nature and the biological, affective, social, and ecological conditions of our existence. This abstract conception of subjectivity leads to reduce ethics and politics to the relations we have with other human beings who are our contemporaries. The only limit to our right to use resources and to do whatever we please for our own preservation is the other human being, future generations, and animals neither enter ethics nor politics. In a nutshell, our anthropological, ethical, and political tools cannot provide adequate guidance at the individual and collective level in the current demographical, technological, and ecological context. It does not enable us to define our obligations toward all the beings we harm in our daily life. When we eat meat, consume dairy products, buy genes which were made or faded by children in manufacturing workshops located in Asia, or when we use polluting energies whose their effects on ecosystems and health will be felt over thousands of years. Note that the structure of our responsibility has changed since we cause damage to numerous beings whom we do not want to harm. As Günther said, a German philosopher, in the age of the atomic bomb and contemporary technologies such as genetic engineering, our responsibility goes far beyond our lifetime. We actually don't know exactly what we are doing, and the number of beings who will be harmed by the effects of our lifestyles and consuming habits is so high that it overcomes our ability to represent them and to feel concerned by their fate. Moreover, the atomistic and even intellectualistic conception of the self, which still underlies our politics, implies that the symmetry of power is a condition for citizenship, as in Hobbes. People suffering from cognitive impairments or beings who cannot give us back what we give them are second-class citizens. They never take part in the process of decision-making and are sometimes condemned to political invisibility. Concerning animals, which cannot set laws in order to set limits to our right to use and abuse them, we consider them as mere means for our ends. On the contrary, once we insist upon our corporality, that is to say our vulnerability, but also our earthly condition, the fact that we need to eat, to breathe, that we occupy space, and so on, we understand that our lives is always intertwined with the lives of the others, be they human or non-human, present or future. We are relational selves. And because we need to be careful, but also because our lifestyles have always an impact upon the others, including animals. Our vulnerability, that is to say, our mortality or exposure to disease, to viruses, and our dependence upon others and nature mean that human existence cannot be simply understood in light of the freedom of our will. Lastly, things we live from and depend upon, like water, food, air, do not only answer our needs, our biological needs, but they please us and make us enjoy life or not. To exist does not mean to survive, but to flourish and feel that life is loved for itself. Therefore, to live from things is also to live with the others. Ethics does not start with the encounter of the other space, and this is a difference between my philosophy of corporality and nourishment and that of Levinas, who inspired me a lot. Not only animals do enter ethics, but also ethics does make sense when we do it. Ethics is a matter of self-limitation. It's a decision to set limits to my right to use whatever pleases me for the sake of others. To live is to live from, to live with, and to live for. Responsibility is as important as freedom, and it changed from within the meaning of freedom. So I have divided my speech into 3 parts. In the first one, I will develop the first chapter of this philosophy of corporality, that is to say, the ethics of vulnerability, and I will say a little words about the context of this work and of the work I did in medical ethics. In the second part, I will develop the second chapter of this philosophy of corporality, and it will be the opportunity to speak of nourishment. And I also will say what is my own approach of ecology and the animal cause, and why it is a little bit different from the standpoint of the American environmental and animal ethics. And in the third part, I will say a few words on virtue ethics, which is at the core of the book I published in 2018, Éthique de la considération. So first part, a phenomenology of corporality, and first chapter, the ethics of vulnerability. To take corporality seriously does not only mean insisting upon our frailty and our mortality. It also emphasizes our passivity and the fact that we do not constitute everything. Then it paves the way to a certain manner of describing human existence. Not only is the alteration of the body the proof that I cannot master everything, but the order also transcends my power to constitute him or to grasp him. He is always more than his appearance. This failure to constitute him makes me acknowledge that the meaning of my relationship with him is ethical. His otherness, his uniqueness, which drives Levinas into speaking of the other's face, challenges me. The existence of the other puts me in question. Following Levinas, I highlight the link between two experiences of passivity which reveals a double dimension of vulnerability. First, passivity refers to the alteration of my body and the incompleteness of my psyche. This is the classical definition of vulnerability as frailty. Second, the encounter of the other is also an experience of passivity. It's a shock. Responsibility is quite different from my family, professional, and social commitments, which derive from it's different from my obligation, which derive from my commitments. Responsibility is an experience which changes from within my subjectivity. I means here I am. There is a primacy of responsibility over freedom. Instead of considering my identity is determined by my will and my individual preferences, I realize that my personal identity, my ipseity, is constituted by the way I answer the other call. And for me, there is also a call coming from animals understood as individual, vulnerable beings. There is a link between these two experiences of passivity because vulnerability makes me be concerned by the other's fate. Only a vulnerable being is able to be responsible for the other. This is why vulnerability cannot be simply equated with frailty. It's also a strength because I am able to be concerned by the other. And the word openness to the other conveys these two experiences, two dimensions of vulnerability. I'm psychologically, physically, and socially fragile and cannot survive without the other's care, affection, and recognition, but I'm also open to the other because I am interested in them. The ethics of vulnerability is the fruit of my readings of Levinas' work and of Ricoeur's work as well, but also it was the fruit of various visits to patients suffering from cognitive impairments and to healthcare professionals working in intensive care units, palliative care, oncology, and so on. Coming back from Boston University, where I spent 1 year teaching medical ethics for healthcare professional students, but also pre-med students, but also to graduate and undergraduate students in philosophy, I decided not only to write a book, which I published in 2009, The Broken Autonomy, Bioethics and Philosophy, but also I wanted to tackle the ethical dilemmas and political debates linked to practical medical practices and biotechnologies. To be sure, autonomy is a key principle in medical ethics, but in the clinical setting, we have to reconfigure this notion, which cannot be simply equated with self-determination, because patients experience fear, depression, and the side effects of treatments. And people suffering from cognitive impairments, well, they have a kind of autonomy, but they are not competent. It's very paradoxical, but we have to reconfigure this notion and to understand that autonomy is not only self-determination, is the ability to have values and desires, and these people have values and desires, although they need somebody to set priorities between their desires, but they lack the ability to express their desires sometimes and to find the adequate, appropriate treatment that corresponds to their will. That is to say that they need people to help them translate their will. So the reconfiguration of autonomy in the clinical setting shed lights upon the moral traits that are required for healthcare professionals in order to care for this person and to decipher their will. And the ethical dilemma and the encounter with patients in the clinical setting, the inquiry into the criteria to withhold life-sustaining treatment in a comatose patient lead to question the criteria to grant moral being consideration, to grant moral consideration to a being. The physician-patient relationship illustrates our responsibility toward the other, and this is why the hospital is a kind of laboratory, because the main ethical and also political concepts such as autonomy, justice, responsibility, personal identity have to be rethought, reconfigured, and sometimes the definition we use are too narrow, not to mention the political problems which are raised by technologies and medical practices which sometimes oblige us to go beyond the no-harm principle we find in John Stuart Mill without advocating paternalism. But the most challenging issue that I mentioned in the Broken Autonomy is the animal question. When you work on vulnerability and describe the passivity of the living, you cannot escape the animal question. Of course, it took me some time to find my own approach. In the book entitled Broken Autonomy, I followed a little bit Peter Singer's and Tom Regan's animal ethics. Their focus on the moral status of animals as sentient beings, and then denounce the practices that inflict excruciating pain on animals. In 2011, in a book entitled The Case for an Ethics of Vulnerability, Humans, Animals, and Nature, I developed my own approach, and the focus is less on the moral status of animals than on us. The focus is on the foundations of our ethics and politics that the animal question helps us to critically examine. As Derrida shows in The Animal That Therefore I Am, Whom to Follow, the animal question is important in itself, but it's also strategic. It highlights the ontological boundaries that underlie traditional humanism and shows that it is based upon the subject defined as an autonomous, rational individual. That is to say, upon an elitist standard that can explain also the discrimination against all the beings that are not like us. However, my inquiry is not only critical. It actually aims at advocating a new way of thinking which implies another humanism. The animal question drives us into making responsibility and vulnerability the major concepts of ethics and politics, because there is somebody behind the fur and there is a call coming from the animal seen as individual selves. Animals put us into question, asking us who we are. I am insofar as I answer the call of the other. Moreover, the animal question is part of a broader approach, encompassing the reflection upon our inhabiting the earth and sharing resources with other beings, including animals. The question is, what would be an ethics and a politics that take animals seriously and aim at promoting a fairer coexistence with them? This approach does not separate humans, animals, and ecology, and it draws a path that travels from ethics to politics in a constructive way. These aspects characterize my work, and the anthropological, if not ontological dimension, and the political one are never separated. Second part, nourishment and political philosophy. The philosophy of nourishment is the second aspect or chapter of the corporalities phenomenology. Nourishment refers to the natural and cultural things I live in and depend upon, and it's a way of avoiding the word resources that reduces the world and nature to tools and our means, and that does not convey the idea of enjoyment. the phenomenological description of eating, dwelling, walking, living in a place, and being co-residents with other humans and animals renews the concept of human existence. Subject is embodied and dependent on natural and cultural things that nourish his or her life, giving it taste. It's also relational. Eating is a paradigm of this philosophy of sensations that describe our being with the world and with the others. Such an embodied rational subject provides a philosophical foundation for another political theory in which the goals of the state can no longer be reduced to security between us, nor to the reduction of unfair inequalities. The protection of the finite biosphere, the alleviation of the animal suffering, and the concern for future generations, and even all the consideration of all the dimensions that enable us to flourish and not only to survive, frame a new social contract which corresponds to the normative aspect of such a political theory. Whereas the phenomenology of nourishment, which is developed in part 1 of the book, stands for the foundation of this theory, the social contract, part 2, represents its pillar. It establishes the criteria of politics, and the last chapters deal with the conditions of a reconstruction of democracy and refer to the institutional and cultural innovations that could enable us to fulfill the promises entailed in the new social contract. This global approach, which connects human beings, animals, and nature, overcomes the modern and contemporary dualism between nature and culture, and this dualism explains why political theories until now do not succeed in making ecology and animals enter democracy. But environmental ethics fails as well, since it reinstalls dualism between nature and culture, as seen with ecocentrism and the focus on wilderness. To be sure, environmental ethics, as seen in Leopold in Bert Kennicott, rejects the idea of the human being as an empire within an empire, and nobody can deny their theoretical creativity. However, environmental ethics does not succeed in fostering people to change their lifestyles, and it does not provide adequate guidance to change the goals of the state. And to avoid these two pitfalls, I myself consider ecology and animal welfare as chapters of a philosophy of existence that takes into account our materiality and our corporeality. So the phenomenological method is all important, and in this approach that does not reduce ecology to its environmental dimension, that is to say, to the reduction of climate change. Understood as the wisdom of our inhabitation of the earth, it includes social justice and a deep transformation of our models of productions, and its moral and spiritual dimension is also all important. This dimension refers to our way of considering our responsibility and our place in the universe, as well as the role played by nature and animals in our life. Before speaking of these dimensions that leads to virtue ethics, let me speak of the conditions that could make ecology and the animal cause enter democracy. And as time flows, I'm going to focus on the strategies that could enable us to make the animal cause be political in the context of a pluralistic society in which people do not share the same interests nor the same conceptions of the good. So how is it possible to achieve to succeed in alleviating the animal question in such a context? Well, as I said before, the animal question is strategic because it sheds light upon a model of development that dehumanizes us. The way we exploit animals without respecting their basic needs and their subjectivity is the mirror of what such a model of development has made of us. And it's so violent that many people use psychological devices such as cognitive dissonance, denial, or they repress their emotions in order to continue to function. And this erosion of moral sense makes people be more and more indifferent to the other's suffering. And to denounce the animal abuse is a way of denouncing such a system. So the animal cause is the central chapter of a global project of reconstruction that aims at promoting another model of development based on the respect for the living, be they human or non-human, with their environmental, social, and sanitary conditions of existence are all important. Ecological transition has now 4 pillars which cannot be separated. First, the protection of our biosphere and the respect for the planetary limits. Second, health. Third, social justice, conditions of work, and 4, justice toward animals. However, how is it possible to alleviate the animal suffering and even to drive people into thinking that animals have the right to exist and are not mere means for our ends? How is it possible to achieve this short-term target and this long-term goal? Also, a lot of people are still making money by exploiting animals, or consider that bullfighting, hunting with wood are traditions which express human fight against animality and death. So, in a pluralistic society, nobody can impose his or her own views and to the others and grant policies upon them. We have to institute the common good by listening to all the stakeholders and to achieve agreements about our disagreements. This does not mean that we will refuse conflictuality, but the differences between ethics and politics is that one can be pure in ethics, in one's lifestyles, in one's kitchens. But when we have to set laws, we are not alone and we have to negotiate and to be candid too. To make the animal cause be political is challenging, since they neither can vote nor have the capacity to prosecute us. They need human beings to make their interests be represented and taken into account in the public place. This asymmetry between human beings and animals explains that those who are committed to the animal cause must convince their fellow citizens that the alleviation of the animal suffering and the suppression of some practices do not lead to economic misery. Transition, innovation, and conversion are the main principles of a strategy which aims at helping those who exploit animals to evolve and find their place in a less violent world for animals. Such practices must be suppressed in the short run, since they are useless and are rejected by the majority of the population. And I give some details in the third part of Animal Manifesto, in which I say why this and that practice should be suppressed in the short run and why. But we have to understand that we all have prejudices, and the animal cause is one of the main chapters of a larger movement which requires a deep transformation of our ways of being and thinking, and this has something to do with the acceptance of our vulnerability we share with them, with the recognition of the otherness of the other, with the eradication of domination. Therefore, the moral progress that would lead to promote another model of development corresponds to what I call the age of the living. It implies we do no longer need to exert our power over the others, but this implies an enlargement of the self, which explains that we are able to feel that the flourishment of the others is part of our own one. And I have 5 minutes to speak of virtue ethics, third part. The reduction of the gap between theory and practice is a main challenge today when we deal with issues connected with the animal cause ecology. Everybody knows the risk, but we sometimes have the solution, but we do not behave in the right way. Two, in order to respond to this challenge, I have developed a virtue ethics in a book entitled Éthique de la considération. Instead of focusing on principles or on the consequences of our actions, virtue ethics is interested in our concrete motivations, that is to say, in the representations and the effects that encourage us to act. And it shows the link between the representation, the evaluation, the values, and the desires, and of course the behavior. It insists also on the moral traits that could lead us to be temperate and to have pleasure in doing the good deed instead of being constantly torn between happiness and duty. Respectful nature and the other beings does not derive from duties or norms, not essentially. It supposes a deep change in our way of being. The ethics of consideration takes its source from the morals of antiquity, but it rejects its essentialism. It is based upon a philosophy of the subject that takes our corporality seriously, and I then speak of human condition, not of human nature. However, I borrow from Aristotle and Plato their focus on freedom and deliberation, and these two aspects distinguish virtue ethics from the ethics of care, for which our capacities to answer the other's need derive from the particular bonds that tie us to them. The specificity of my approach is to say the key to environmental virtue is a process of individuation that entails a deepening of our awareness of what unites us to the other living beings and transforms the consciousness of our belonging to a common world into a lived knowledge. I have borrowed from Spinoza the idea that a process of individuation that enlarges ourselves can change our relationship with others and create new effects such as joy and gratitude, as in Ernest, the great Norwegian philosopher who always refers to Spinoza when he speaks of ecosophy, this enlargement of the self, which implies knowledge of our interactions with other forms of life, explains that we have pleasure by consuming less. We are also able to integrate in our own good the common good that entails nature. This means that the choice of real goods or prudence in Aristotle do not suffice to change us. Consideration encompasses prudence and all the virtues, but it is not a virtue. It's rather the global attitude upon which all the virtues are grounded. And it rests upon two notions we don't find in Aristotle. First, its condition is humility, which is not a virtue either, but a way, a method, a way of preparing for consideration by reminding us that we are ungendered, vulnerable beings and that we have limits, which means that we cannot be virtuous once for all. Second, consideration suppose an experience of the incommensurable, which connects ethics to the spiritual level. I borrow this from Bernard de Clairvaux, who said that only faith can foster real concern for others and extirpate domination. We speak of domination. By contrast, in my work, consideration which come from cum, with, Sidus Sideris, constellation of stars, and which implies looking carefully at a being while acknowledging his value, is defined by transcendence. This word, which was coined by a friend of Levinas, Chanval, does not describe a movement from bottom to top, as faith in God, but it's a way of speaking of something that overcomes us. It's the experience of the common world, which is infinite and entails the past, future, and present generations, the institution and the other speakers. To be born means that we belong to this world that is older than us and welcomes us when we come to life. When we are mindful of our ungendered condition and experience our vulnerability, we better feel the bonds that tie us with other ungendered and vulnerable beings. Transcendence actually outlines a movement of deepening of oneself and of one's carnal condition that permits the subject to experience the link that unites him or her to the other human and non-human beings. Such an experience transforms the consciousness of one's belonging to the common world into lived knowledge that changes from within one's way of being and interacting with others. And this has also consequences, political consequences, because the moral traits and capacities which are necessary to take part in political life and reinforce democracy are at stake in such an approach of morality. And in concluding remark, far from being the rejection of humanism, the promotion of a more sustainable and fairer model of development, which corresponds to what I call the age of the living, is an opportunity to renew humanism, to promote a new humanism. The point is to eradicate domination, which is, as Adorno and Horkheimer said, a threefold domination: upon nature and animals, upon the other human beings, social domination, and upon oneself and one's sensitivity. This domination turns rationality into irrationality and leads to totalitarianism, but also to capitalism, and it makes technology completely autonomous. This is why it is not only necessary today to defend enlightenment against the counter-enlightenment and the awakening of nationalism, the rejection of nationality and human rights. We must suggest a new enlightenment, one which requires to resist the amputation of reason, now reduced to an instrument for domination and calculation. This is why the objective of the enlightenment at the age of the living, I further develop in my forthcoming book, and of its projects for an ecological and democratic society, is to eliminate the domination schema, which expresses a contempt for the body and for vulnerability. And I show why corporality and the reconciliation with one's vulnerability renew rationalism and enable us to fulfill the promises of the ancient Enlightenment by avoiding their hegemonistic trend, criticizing their anthropocentrism and overcoming the dualism between nature and culture, which explains their failure to protect us from destructiveness and barbarity. So thank you. I was a little bit long.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Corinne. It was so convincing. I really appreciate also the way you feel necessary to reduce the difference between theory and practice. And I think that's a main part of your discourse and of your commitments to not only to speak of the animal rights or animal philosophy, but also to see all the consequences and the political consequences of this acknowledgement of, the subjectivity of animals. I have many questions, well, let me say just a couple of questions about your topic. About perhaps, about the subjectivity, because of course, I agree with you about the status of subject for animals, but I would like you to explain perhaps more about the, how would I say that, about the difference between ethics and law, because because we are speaking about rights, animal rights. So how do you conceive the rights without any reciprocity? I mean, of course, because I can understand, especially with Levinas, that you know very well, that's in a moral relationship, there is no necessary reciprocity.
Sure.
You are responsible for the non-responsible. Okay, that's okay, but that's a moral attitude. So, in terms of rights, how can you give non-human beings the status of a subject of right? Not only an object that you have to respect. I don't.
Sure.
I dismiss the notion of object for animals, of course, but I can understand that we feel duties regarding animals, but how do you the question of rights without reciprocity?
Yes, it's a very important question. The misunderstanding would be to say, to forget that we human beings grant rights to animals. That is to say that rights are anthropogenic, the source. Those who give rights and to write rights are humans. But this does not mean that the content of the rights are anthropocentric. That is to say that animals, of course, they do not speak like us, but they have something to say to us. And their subjectivity, their basic needs, the fact that the pig needs to go this and there, and their basic needs and their subjectivity oblige us and set limits to our right to use whatever we please with them. That is, and in our relation with them, we can translate into human words what they need and what they can expect from us. That is to say that rights are human tools that set limits to our right to do whatever we need for our own preservation. But animals, their existence set limits to us, and we human beings have to acknowledge this and to translate it into words so that we can determine some rules that are not only for us, but that take into account the animal's interests. And so it's a job for human beings. So law is a tool for human beings, and but the content of the law is not only for us. So this is very important. And also we have now some theory of animal rights, which are sophisticated because they do not only speak of the inviolability of animals, negative rights, but they also have a relational conception of rights who can, of course, but it exists in animal welfare. I know that a lot of people criticize this notion, and I understand why, but animal welfare, you have 5 freedoms, and the 4th one oblige people to provide conditions of life for their animals that enable these animals to flourish, so to express their own ethological norms. So we have positive rights too. But the problem with animals and the problem with rights is that first, justice goes beyond rights. Justice is a matter of understanding that we are not the tyrant of creation, that we are not an empire within an empire. We have not an absolute sovereignty upon nature and the other beings. And the second problem with rights is that we have good rights, especially in Europe, but we do not apply them. So the point is to make animals enter politics, which means the following: we have to make human beings understand that animals do count, and that we share resources and landscapes with them, and that forests are not virgin. They have beings who live there, so we cannot do whatever we please. So it's a matter of limits. This is why, of course, we cannot. There is a distinction between ethics and law, but animals are not only moral patients we care for or we protect. They have things to say to us, even if we don't want to listen to them.
Mm. Thank you very much. It's very convincing. Another question about vulnerability. Why do you feel the necessity of basing our common belonging to nature on vulnerability? Because don't you think that it means that we are defined by our passivity, weakness, victimness, and Yes, it's a bit provocative.
Yeah.
But,
Well,
because
your question will be an opportunity for me to distinguish my approach from the standpoint of ethics of care and even ecofeminism, because the notion of vulnerability has a critical function. It drives us into thinking autonomy not as self-determination, but as relational autonomy. And autonomy is less, but vulnerability for people working in ethics of care is equated with frailty and sometimes, whereas I also focus on autonomy, which remains an horizon. It isn't sometimes not a starting point, but a starting of a point of departure, but it is a starting, an horizon, an aim. And for me, virtue ethics also, vulnerability for the ethics of care is understood as frailty, and it is understood in a psychological way. The relational subject is understood in a psychological or social way in light of social domination, whereas I come from phenomenology, German and French phenomenology, especially from Levinas. That is to say that I try to describe human condition by finding some structures of existence, and this as a universal dimension, whereas in the ethics of care, it's a particularistic ethics. The moral traits that enable us to care for the others derive from the particular bonds which we have with people or beings. Whereas I start with the subject, and in Levinas, responsibility change from within or subjectivity, and it's not psychological at all. And so vulnerability is not a way of being only passive, it's a way of highlighting our corporality, the fact that we die, the fact that we, when we are tired, we did not want to be tired. So it's passivity in this sense is a fact, but also which sheds light upon our human existence, which is of course freedom, will, but also project, but also receptivity. And vulnerability is not everything, because corporality refers to our enjoyment and to the fact that we need things and that nourish us, give us taste, give to our life taste or not. So, and I think that the sources, the inspirations of an ethical approach are all important. And the way I understand the relational character of the subject is a little bit different from the way the ethics of care understands it. And not to mention the fact that I follow, I have elaborated a virtue ethics, that is to say that the key to my responsibility toward the others, or the key to subjective or intersubjective virtues, is a relationship with myself. A work, ethics is a matter of self-transformation, as in Christian thought, as in Spinoza, this enlargement of the self, something you don't find in the ethics of care. Or and the world dominion too, the ethics of care, or Philippe Petit and all these persons, they understand domination as social domination. For me, it's one thing, but I think that the point is to understand the root of this. This is why I follow, again, German Jews, Adorno and Horkheimer, who understand the threefold dimension of domination, and the way our reason itself was reduced to a mean for calculation. And this is, I come from Leo Strauss, I come from this German thinking, and I come back to it. So I think this is very important. So for me, vulnerability is not only frailty, it's a kind of strength too. It's an ability to not to be self-centered, to be responsible, and also to be free. So it's quite different.
Okay, thank you so much. Speaking of enlargements and the way you present an enlargement of subjectivity, what's the limit of this enlargement? And because I mean that, of course, speaking of environments and nature, you encompass non-animal beings. So what are the limits of this enlargement in your ethics? You want to involve also the non-animal beings in your common belonging to.
Well, in Spinoza, in book 5 of Ethics of Spinoza, he describes this enlargement of the self. The fact that my knowledge of the all, what you call the all, and in contemporary terms, as Ernest translated it, my knowledge of my interactions with the other forms of life changes me and gives birth to new affects, such as gratitude, the wonder, and so on. That is to say that in Spinoza, intellect is love too. All representations have an impact upon our desires, our way of thinking our place in the universe. But your question is very important because it helps me distinguish my approach from those who think that it's a kind of mystical fusion. As a girl of enlightenment, as a girl who tried to elaborate, who has tried to elaborate virtue ethics, I consider freedom is all important. And consideration means that you can acknowledge you can make room for the others because you know your place. And to know your place, as Bernard of Clairvaux said in De Consideratione, you have to not to forget that you were at the beginning a little baby who come from another person and two persons. Well, our birth installs intersubjectivity in subjectivity. And what is very important in Bernard of Clairvaux is the fact that he highlights the importance of our carnal condition, which makes us, which explains that we cannot understand ourselves, and that we are not virtuous once for all. And there is, so this is why we have to, for humility is a kind of method. Will remind you of your limits, mortality, but also the fact that you can be vulnerable to you can be tempted by domination. And so this is but the enlargement of the self is the fact that you stop considering that you are an empire within an empire, and you feel the dependence upon the elements. And this is not only an abstract knowledge. And of course, for a lot of people, their awareness of their belonging to a common world is a little bit abstract. And this is why it does not change their life, they do not change their lifestyles. But once you feel that you are not an empire within an empire. And once you deepen your knowledge of yourself as an ungendered being, you, through some experience, you change, and you are able, you stop you stop exerting your power over things, but you make room for the others. And I think that ethics is a matter of self-limitation and the ability to make room for the others, be they human and non-humans, but it requires that you know yourself. This is why all the virtues you find in Aristotle, but also in Christian ethics, in Christianity, are very important. On Descartes, his definition of generosity, before giving to the others, before being able to care for the others, you have to free yourself from a lot of things. And as a girl of enlightenment, I overvalue, I estimate a lot freedom and all the self-transformation. Without that, I think it's not possible to be confronted with all the challenges we are confronted with without avoiding a government by fear. So I think that if we want ecology, the animal cause and so on be a project of emancipation, and we have to be strong enough to free ourselves from some prejudices and to know our place, and then to take part in this process of this big movement, which could enable us to step by step to promote another model of development.
Is it why you maintain the notion of humanism, universalism?
Yes, exactly.
Because you could get rid of it.
I don't.
Humanism, is it possible to speak of humanism without, without repeating the centrism of human?
This is a challenge. I think that, of course, a lot of people, great smart people like Derrida and many others have criticized humanism, like Claude Lévi-Strauss, who said that our humanism was built on prejudices and I would say amour-propre. It was a false humanism because we do not, the criteria which were used to grant a being moral consideration were very elitist, of course. And but I think that for me, I do not get rid of humanism. There's a very nice French expression, ne pas jeter le bébé clos du bain. That is to say that we do not get rid of everything. Of course, Enlightenment, humanism can be criticized, and postmodernity has addressed good ethics. But and ecology too, of course, because it was anthropocentrism.
Yeah, but, for example, Omnes, for example, there is not only the French philosopher like Derrida, but
Leopold and so on.
Granting, the nature and ecology.
Yes, but Omnes, it's paradoxical because he estimates freedom, self-transformation. Ecosophy is a way of understanding our interactions with the other forms of life, but everybody has his or her own ecosophy. So it does not get rid of freedom nor subjectivity. And humanism for me, it's, I know that there are other approaches, but I try to renew humanism, but I remain in humanism because the starting point of to protect animals and nature, we have to start with humans, but to change humans and to change the philosophy of the subject that still underlies our ethics and politics. I know that some people get rid of humanism, but well, it's not my case because I work I have two pillars. The one is the philosophy of the subject, and it was the ethics of vulnerability. It was the philosophy of nourishment and also virtue ethics. And the second pillar is political philosophy. And how can you build a democratic society if you don't have autonomous persons? So and it was the problem, the pitfall of a part of Annes's philosophy in his platform of norms. When you start with a platform of norms, like the acknowledgement of the intrinsic value of things and so on, how can you build a democratic society in which there are a lot of people who do not share the same things? So I think that for me, the key is self-transformation, and also, like in enlightenment, the key for moral and political progress, if we dare to speak of that, is the subject. But of course, in the context, in the ecological context, and in my thinking, this subject has nothing to do with even the Kant's subject, which advocated dualism and which was anthropocentric. And more than that, I think that we cannot get rid of rationality, but we have to think a rationality which does not turn into irrationality. So, but of course, there are people who come from different traditions and who can speak otherwise. I have a friend of mine, a writer. She is animiste, and when she speaks with me, of course, I think that it's marvelous. But I am a Western girl, so I speak of what I know.
So about Western, could we say something about the situation of contemporary philosophy on both sides of the ocean, the relation between continental and American philosophy? Let me say something about a strange situation of thinkers like you in France. The fact I'm struck by the fact that thinkers, scholars who write on animals in France are women. In the US, well, you quoted you made a reference to Peter Singer, Tom Regan, or Charles Peterson. Anyway, and there are so many thoughts in different fields, law, phenomenology, history in the United States. So how do you explain that? Well, it's just a feeling, perhaps it's superficial, but I mean, I think that we should remind to the American audience that in France, a book written by Luc Ferry was such a caricature, was such a terrible, stupid thing about what is ecology and animal rights and so on. But anyway, well, it's still perhaps in the French mentality to think that's, well, deep ecology, that's so irrational. But anyway, sorry, I'm a bit confused because there are different in the same question. But yes, coming back to this, the fact that how do you explain that? Yes, I could. Well, I'll let you perhaps refer to your colleagues and.
I'm not sure I will be able to answer you. I don't know why there are women who tackle these issues. To be sure, animal ethics is getting growing interest in France, but it's very recent. And just a story, when I did my habilitation, it was, well, 11 years ago, the people in my committee laughed at me. Well, Corine likes animals, so ecology, and of course in political philosophy, because I came from that, and I'm still political philosopher. Well, they were nice, but they thought that my commitment to the animal cause and to ecology was weird. So I think that things have evolved, and nowadays it's funny because even in the politic sphere, people want to be say that they are committed to this cause, so they want to be a good fighter for animals, defender. So that's great because they will do the job, and I become. It reminds me of what Hegel says: people want to be to have success, and in fact they work for themselves, but it will be useful for the good, for animals. So I'm happy. So I don't know why it's like that. Well, what I can see is that a lot of young scholars are interested in the animal cause and ecology, and they focus on American stuff and the American stuff. And sometimes they repeat what Americans have done, which is good.
Don't you think that's because don't you think that it's because these American references were completely ignored before? You can see, for example, Isabelle de Fontenay. She knows nothing about. She dismissed all the American studies.
That's right. But she's smart. But she dismissed, yes. But I think that well, I think that it's good to know both movements. As far as I'm concerned, I like phenomenology, like Florence Burga, but I have read Peter Singer and so on, Kimlicka and Donaldson. I was a person who tried to make them translated because I worked for Alma, and I insisted upon the importance of this book, Political Theory of Animal Rights. And what I can notice is that young scholars sometimes only focused on the American writings, but it's a general trend. And for me, it's very interesting, but I remain very interested in German philosophy and the German sources of the critical thinking, Adorno, Horkheimer, phenomenology. And so I think both are interesting, and there are room for everybody. I hope that young scholars will not equate thinking with ideology. And this is a problem because I receive a lot of students who want to make their dissertation under my direction, and I refuse, not only because I have enough work, but also because they equate philosophy, which is critical thinking, with ideology. I think the commitment to animal cause and ecology is important, but it sometimes requires some time before people are able to define their own approach. And so I'm sometimes very skeptical of the project I receive. So, and in France, sometimes people discover some issues, discover some writings, and they put it in French. So it's not very interesting because it already exists in English. And we read English, although we sometimes do not speak very well because it's a very difficult language, but we read English and we like American philosophers. But I think it's very important to stay at one's place and to use the resources of one's tradition. And there is a richness in phenomenology, in critical thinking, that is also very interesting for these issues. And as far as I'm concerned, when I was writing the book Éthique of Considération, which is a virtue ethics for today, I read, of course, read again Aristotle and so on, and I wanted to read some books on environmental virtue ethics, but I find that it was less good than Spinoza or Descartes or Bernard de Clairvaux. And I find my great inspiration in Bernard de Clairvaux, middle age. So I think that sometimes when you Plato, Aristotle, Spinoza, when you read these classical philosophers, you can read them 1, 2, 3, 4, 20 times, and you always discover something. So
there is a question from Yanis Tsiligakis, who asks, do you think the West idealizes truth and knowledge, trespassing from the rational to the irrational?
Excuse me? Do you think the West
idolizes truth and knowledge, trespassing from the rational to the irrational,
Trespassing, that is to say, well, West is very big. There are many trends in Western thought. And to be sure, Western civilization has cut reason from nature. And it is true that there are some dualisms between nature, culture, mind, body, reason, emotions. And these dualisms maybe explain that reasons became full, like Adorno and Horkheimer said in Dialectique der Aufklärung. Dialectique, they showed that something in reason was lost at the end of modernity, but maybe since the beginning of Western civilization. And I think it's very important today to face, to deal with this question. What is reason? What kind of rationalism do we want? Remember that it was at the core of the Vienna lecture of Husserl in 1935. And he says, well, the crisis of values, and he was in the mid-30s, he was a Jew, he knew what was going on, Nazism was coming, and was there. And he said, the crisis of values is also a crisis of method. We have cut reason from Lebenswelt, from the monde de la vie. We have cut reason from the world of life, and then we enter kind of destructive dialectic. We came to understand that reason was only a mean for calculation, and it opens, it paves the way for catastrophes. And I think it's very interesting because Husserl wants to renew rationalism. And I think that it's important, that I think that the challenge of the West is there. And again, there are also different traditions who have different challenges, although we all are confronted with the same problems, ecological, health, and so on. And but you know, we cannot dismiss reason without advocating counter-enlightenment and the aid of reason is also responsible for something which was a tragedy in Germany, for instance. So during the National Socialism. So I think that we have a lesson, something very deep in Husserl. So I'm not sure I have answered completely, but this question is very important for me, and it's at the core of my forthcoming book, Enlightenment at the Age of the Living. It is the central issue is, what is reason today? How can we understand, how can we renew rationalism so that we avoid this destruction of rationality, which opens the road to social, political catastrophes.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so there's a lot to say, and well, the same the same topics came in the Q&A, but I think that's for a further discussion. I would like to ask you a last question today, because the time is going on, and so it's about perhaps practically your relationship with the association. Are you in contact with the political association or animal rights association, and could you say something about also this perhaps recent commitment around L214? And
yes, I did a lot of things with them, with Animalist Party. I wrote Animalist Manifesto before the birth of the Animalist Party in France. I knew that something was going on. I knew the co-foundator, people who run this party. And I'm very close to one association, One Voice. And also I know well L214, but I did a lot of lecture and so on. And I wanted 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago to provide some tools that could make the animal question be political in a pluralistic society without focusing on denunciation. But of course, it's very difficult. But it was my contribution, and I always was often interviewed by people in government and so on, by politicians, and I took part to many things. I have a little bit stopped because it was time consuming, and as I said, I think the job is done. I met a lot of politicians last year and 2 years ago, I think that the job is done. That is to say that they have understood that the animal cause is, of course, important in itself, but they have understood that it's not only a fashionable issue, that it has a depth. And
would you say there is more concern on the left or on the right?
I would not say that, because at the beginning, the left was interested, and it's sure that the animal question, the violence inflicted upon animals sheds light upon a model of development, and there is a link between the critique of capitalism and capitalism as the limitless exploitation of all the beings and the animal cause. But nowadays, and I think it's good, many movements, political movements, well, try to show that they are concerned. And as I said, sometimes we can laugh a little bit at this, because we sometimes are skeptical. But I think that they really have understood that the civil society or people are really concerned. And for me, and it was at the core of my approach of the animal question, the animal cause is the cause of everybody. It's a universal cause. It's not and I think that once people are concerned, it's a code that everybody has something to do at his or her own level. So, but it is true that in France we are in a country in which we speak a lot, and I'm still waiting for the concrete results.
Yeah. Are you confident? Have you hope about this new awareness of animal suffering?
Well, the problem is that there is a gap between theory and practice. But young people are more and more concerned. And it's true that 5 years ago it was difficult to speak of that without being laughed at. Now it has changed, so it's a kind of progress. But of course, things are very slow, and France is very late compared to other European countries. And I think also that for ecology, for the animal cause, the problem is that we have to advocate a pragmatic approach with all the stakeholders. The point is to suppress some practices, but also to evolve. And well, we are in France. It's everything is complicated. I think, and I think that polemics sometimes do not help. So I don't know whether I'm optimistic, but I'm sure that this cause enters history because it's part of a broader movement, which I call the age of the living. And the ecology, the concern for animals, the desire of people to eat in a different way and to show what kind of world they want to live in their consuming habits. I think that this shows a movement, a road, but at the same time we are at a crossroads, because at the same time we have nationalism, we have dominion, we have, even in a great country, I like country in America. So we are at a crossroad, and the competing forces are very strong, and we don't know who will win. But I think the stakes revolve around these things: the living, the otherness, our responsibility. And I do think that the acceptance of vulnerability, corporality, mortality, all these things, all this acceptance is very important, because you can't set limits to our right to do whatever you please and to use technologies for everything if you don't consider that you are not alone, and if you don't understand your own limits. So we have an appointment with some old questions of metaphysics and the meaning of life and so on, which is a good news, which is good news for philosophers.
Okay, very last question for the last 5 minutes. Do you think from animal rights we will talk about plants' rights? And would this bring the underlying premise of the animal rights movement, which is that we are unnaturally cruel to animals, to a full circle back to the initial approach of humanity, that animals and plants, for that matter, are part of nature, and we can use them to advance the human species? May I add to this question? That's also perhaps a problem now with this awareness of the sensibility of plants and this, very fashion thinking about, the dialogue with plants, with trees, and the fact that yes, if we acknowledge that there are sensibilities in plants, it means that we can use them, and we can use every living being.
Well, I think that there is a difference between sensitivity and sentience. And the word sentience, which was coined by Jeremy Bentham, and which is at the core of animal ethics, is very important. It's the way of being at the center of one's existence, to not only to feel things or to react with its environment, but to live one's life, to be a subject. And there is a very big differences and even boundaries between plants and animals and humans, because we feel not only pain but suffering with a psychological content and fear, and there's something tragic in our existence, which Florence Burga said very well. And well, of course, plants are not like stones, but they are not sensitive in the same way as us. And I have no problem with vegetable. I eat vegetable, but I don't want to eat an animal which want to live and who is somebody. A plant is not somebody. It's not a thing. It's not something you can destroy, and maybe we can speak of indirect duties toward them. But animals, their existence oblige us. And well, those who say that is the same thing, they have to look at the fear of an animal who is killed and who feels that he will die with sometimes excruciating pain. So I think that, of course, the problem is now that we want to blur everything. We want to blur every boundary. And I don't eat animals. I don't wear leather and so on. So, but I do not say that we are like animals. We have a lot in common with animals, but we are different. And we have to remind us of great philosophers like Montaigne, who said that there are some, and even Derrida says things that are very similar. We have differences and similarities between humans and animals. And with plants, it's another universe that we maybe are not able to completely understand. So I think that nowadays people blur everything, and of course there are some bestsellers in which you find very nice metaphors, but metaphors are not concepts. And to say that the tree is suffering, of course you can create a damage to a plant when the plant has no light and no water, but it's not the same thing as the hunger and that death. It's quite different. And this is why the phenomenological description, which focuses on the Erlebnis, vécu, I don't know the English word, my German is better. And so the experience, the subjective experience of things is something that sentient beings have. And this is a difference.
Thank you very much, Corine Pelluchon. We will welcome Florence Burga soon too, to discuss this matter. And once again, thank you very much for being with us. And for our attendees, see you next week, next Thursday. Our guest will be Yves Cusset about philosophy and comedy. Bye-bye.
So bye-bye.